Good morning again. Gentleman in the back corner, Mr. Hamilton. How are you?
Good.
Excellent. Thank you for the prior presentation.
Good to be here.
It's good that you can be here. So I want to introduce our next speaker for the third session, Dr. John Scala. Many of you have already seen him on TV, and his reputation precedes him. Dr. Scala was the first, and his full CV and resume is in there. I'm going to hit the highlights. He was the first on-camera storm analyst for the Weather Channel. He was the training coordinator for the Weather Channel. He was the associate director for the Center for Disaster Research and Education at Millersville. He was a broadcast meteorologist at WGAL up until March of 2017. And currently, he works with FEMA and works as a meteorological consultant. He holds a BS in Biology and Geology from the University of Rochester, a Master's of Science in Environmental Sciences, concentration in Geology, and we're going to continue with the University of Virginia Cavalier theme here from the University of Virginia, and has his Ph.D. in Environmental Sciences, concentration in Meteorology from the University of Virginia. So a little war story here as to how meteorology comes into play in your cases and in risk management issues. I had a slip and fall case a few years ago where an elderly gentleman comes in and from all appearances seems to simply pass out. And as we go through depositions, says, well, it was wet. It was wet in front of the cash register. People were tracking in water because there was this torrential, superstorm Lee that had come up many years ago, and it was raining, and there were no mats down. And you go ahead and you do some research, and you talk with some consultants. The only problem is this was on a Friday, and this particular tropical storm didn't come through Berks County until Saturday night. So nice theory, but you're off by 24 to 36 hours, and the case eventually went away. So obviously, weather can play into just about any case, and almost anything that you do. As you can see, if it was raining like last year, we were not going to fly drones, and we had the weather today that enabled us to fly drones. But whether or not you're looking at a motor vehicle case and you have torrential rains, whether or not you represent a commercial fleet carrier or a truck driver and you have a spontaneous flash whiteout condition that occurs along Interstate 80, or you have a slip and fall case that might occur due to water being tracked into a particular commercial establishment, or whether or not you represent and insure an apartment complex that is being alleged to not taking care of snow and ice conditions in the middle of winter. After all, this is central Pennsylvania. Weather comes into play in all different shapes and forms, and Dr. Scala is here to talk to us about how he can help us evaluate and manage those risks. Dr. Scala.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And also a great thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. I also want to thank National Forensics for making this opportunity available to me. So Kelly and Steph are in the back. If you'd like to speak with them about what National Forensics can do for you, they are available. Mr. O'Neill commented on a variety of cases, many of which, in fact, I think all of which, I actually have been involved in. I stepped back from television in the last year because I just don't have the time for it. And frankly, I'm not interested in doing the 11 o'clock news anymore or working every weekend, which is what I did for years. I find this kind of work much more appealing, and I can set my own schedule, except when an attorney calls me on the phone and says, I need your report today. Of these three images that are in front of you, which one was taken in Pennsylvania? All three, perhaps. Well, they could have been, right. The only one that is not, and you wouldn't know that, is the image down here. Oops. Sorry, let's go back. Just gave away what I was going to show you. I thought this had a pointer on it. There we go. That doesn't show up. My finger can point very well. So this one is a roof failure in New Jersey that actually resulted in subrogation. The contractor was actually gone after by the insurance company. But the other two are in Pennsylvania, and both of them within an hour or an hour and a half of where we are seated right now. So there is a wealth of weather that we experience in the state of Pennsylvania. The cases that I've been involved in, and I'm going to show you some of these, have stretched from Maine to Florida and west to Idaho. Weather plays an astounding role in much of what we do in the risk business. A couple of years ago, as a member of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, I was given the opportunity to meet and talk with E.J. Wagner, who wrote this book on the science of Sherlock Holmes. I think when I was younger, I read every Sherlock Holmes mystery. It just fascinated me. But there's a great quote from one of the stories called The Blanched Soldier. When you have eliminated all which is impossible, then whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Well, what's the truth? It's the data. And that's what I work with. The data is impartial. I just look at what the data tells me and I render an opinion. It has nothing to do with the outcome of the case. It's what is the data telling me? And that's the focus of my work, is to utilize that data that's out there. And Mr. O'Neill mentioned we have a history of whiteouts in the state of Pennsylvania. We have several major thoroughfares that go west to east across the country, and they often run into snow squalls. And we have a history of this kind of thing, and it extends all the way across, in fact, into the Great Lakes. So this picture was taken a few years ago between Chicago and Detroit. And I use that as a backdrop to talk about what forensics is. I give a lot of talks to school kids, and I ask them, do you know what forensics is? No, I don't have any idea what that is. Well, do you watch CSI? Oh yeah, everybody's hand goes up. Do you watch Law and Order? Absolutely. I mean, your parents let you watch the beginning of that program when there's bodies all over the place? Oh yeah. Forensics, obviously, is the application of science to questions of interest within the legal system. And when we adapt that to what I do, which is forensic meteorology, it is the reconstruction of specific weather events. And we take that in specific time and place, and that's what gets applied to criminal or civil litigation. And it is the focus of some of those cases which the majority of this talk will render itself. So let me begin by showing you this. You read the bottom line. There are two types of people in this world: those who can extrapolate from incomplete data. What's number two? Obviously those who cannot, right? Well, if you're doing what I do, you better be able to extrapolate from incomplete data. As an attorney once reminded me in New York, I was testifying in Brooklyn. He said, "Were you on the street corner when that accident occurred?" No, obviously not. Well, then how do you know what the weather was? Well, because we have things called radar. And the radar provides a 1 degree by 1 kilometer resolution box that was sitting on that street corner. And because the weather was exactly the same around that box, I can tell you what was happening on that street corner. And that was it on that particular case. So you have to be able to utilize that data and push it outside the realm of where the specific information was recorded. And that's one of the skill sets. How applicable is the data collected at Harrisburg International Airport to a slip and fall at one of the FedEx terminals, which is just down the road? That was a case that came to me a couple of years ago. So we have to work with the data, but we have to understand, and I always, when I work with an attorney or an insurance adjuster, I always mention you have to understand the uncertainty with that data and also its applicability to whatever the incident may be. That is a picture of a 600,000 gallon gasoline tank, which is obviously not seated where it should be. This was following Hurricane Katrina. I was actually down there twice after Hurricane Katrina. And this picture reminds me of the limitations of the observational record, because before Hurricane Katrina came on shore, there was an extended period of hurricane-force winds with gusts exceeding 100 miles per hour. Well, how do we know that? Now, there was a buoy offshore that reported it because some of the onshore instrumentation failed. The winds were just too strong and the instrumentation failed. There are sometimes errors associated with those instruments. They haven't been calibrated properly. Maybe those instruments haven't been sighted properly, or since they were installed, a bush has grown up next to it. Now, one of the things I look at is not just what the National Weather Service provides, but there are additional networks out there of data that I want to get my grubby hands in, I want to look at. But sometimes they haven't been sited in the right place, like next to somebody's home. And the homeowner will say, well, look, there's nothing out here. Well, what's right behind the instrument? At your house. You can't be there. Well, when I put that instrument up, the tree wasn't there. Well, it is now. And now it affects both the wind and the temperature. So there are sighting artifacts. And there could be misuse of the data. A couple of years ago, I was deposed on a slip and fall case that occurred at a retirement home in Connecticut. And the gentleman, unfortunately, he fell outside his home and ended up experiencing a subdural hematoma and never recovered. So the attorney who represented the retirement village said to me, well, wait a minute, I read your report. You're utilizing data from this site that's way over here. Didn't you know there was an airport right nearby? Why didn't you use that data? Well, because that airport's exposure and its elevation was nothing like where this gentleman fell. And even though this other location, which was further away, was entirely more applicable. And that case went away. We hear from the real estate industry, it's all about location, location, location. In my business, it's all about timing, timing, timing. An event like this that occurs at 1 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon is no big deal. But if you get 1 inch of snow in 15 minutes at 5 o'clock outside Harrisburg, it is a big deal. So it's all about timing. And I use that as a backdrop to represent to you the cases that I have been involved in. Everything here in red is a type of event, or actually a type of case where the meteorology played a role in the outcome of the case. The only two that I haven't been involved in are transportation scheduling impacts, but maybe I have been indirectly. I'd have to think about that. And crop spraying. Everything else on this list, and I'm going to provide some examples of these, I have written an opinion on. And as I mentioned, across several states in the United States. A lot of these are a lack of situational awareness. Meteorologists talk about those are on the hot seat, those are running the radar, or those are looking at the observations when they're trying to decide whether they're going to issue a warning for a specific weather event. They have to maintain their situational awareness. They have to know where they are, what time it is, what the storm is doing, and are these attributes associated with the storm that is likely to go severe in a hurricane. Right. Last week, just about a week away from today, we had a tornado warning in Cumberland County, which is not too far from here. The tornado warning was issued, and then the next day I was out surveying the damage for the Weather Service to make a determination whether that was in fact the tornado that occurred or straight line winds. So all of these cases have some sense of the individual or the circumstance lost situational awareness. I want you to look at these two pictures. These are from actually an event that I was at in Las Vegas about 1.5 years ago. Live Design International. Huge trade show. Huge. Do you think they've lost situational awareness in this picture? In both of them? Those are exits that are now blocked. Next picture. This is actually the ad from a program at an event that I was at in 2017. And it says, hot, smoking, blazing, the PA system, not the band. It's an insurance company that put this advertisement in a brochure that was at a meeting for people who are in the live entertainment industry to improve their understanding of severe weather. And in particular, I was asked to talk about lightning at this meeting. To talk about what we can do to make outdoor festivals safer for the people who are there. And I saw this in the brochure. I said, I called the guy out. Are you kidding me? Isn't this directly opposed to what we're doing here? We're trying to maintain situational awareness. And you've got an ad that looks like this. So this is the talk that I gave that day in front of about 200 or 250 people, all involved with the live entertainment industry. So it was pretty cool to kind of rub elbows with production managers and stage managers associated with some of the live acts you're all familiar with. And this is at Rock Lidditz. So for those of you that are not local, Rock Lidditz is the largest indoor facility available for a live act to practice. So my understanding is when U2 comes up to this little town north of Lancaster, which is now known as the greatest small town in America, Lidditz, Pennsylvania. Apparently when U2 shows up to practice, they bring 35 tractor trailers and they back them up, and this place is so huge that they can mount everything and put everything out that they would at a live show. What a great audience to talk about. Don't lose your situational awareness when severe weather is about to take place. Well, the average individual loses that situational awareness when they walk outside into a parking lot after a snow event and they fall. And the first thing they're going to do is sue the owner of the property, and they're going to sue the contractor who's supposed to be responsible for that. Right now, I have a case where I'm looking at the weather associated with a snowstorm in New York City. There's an individual who fell in the parking lot outside of Sears store. Apparently, he fell after letting the plow go by, and then he stepped where the plow had just plowed and stepped on something and fell during a blizzard. There are 3 major airports surrounding this Sears store, all reporting a quarter-mile visibility of heavy snow. That's an ongoing weather event. We've lost situational awareness. Perhaps one of the earliest examples of forensics in a court case was this one that took place in Beardstown, Illinois. This actually was a trial where Abraham Lincoln, the pre-presidential Abraham Lincoln, in May of 1858, defended the son of a longtime friend of his. The son's name was William Duff Armstrong. His old-time friend, Jack Armstrong, had deceased by this point, but it was his wife who said, "Would you defend my son who has been jailed in a homicide?" And he is being cited as one of 2 people that killed another man in a brawl that occurred at midnight. So Abraham Lincoln used the almanac and said, well, I can tell you where the moon was at the time of the event, and it was a half moon and it was setting. So there was a question of, well, how could the witness have seen, was there enough light, enough moonlight to actually shine on the face of the potential perpetrators? And he won that case. Here's an example for you. You can see the corn being laid down. There was a crop damage claim. A farmer's tobacco crop was insured against hail. He put in a claim to his insurance company saying his crop was completely destroyed by hail. Okay, so there was an investigation. The storm contained 90-mile-per-hour winds, but no hail. And he was not covered for wind. He lost that. These are the kinds of cases that I get involved in. A humorist once said, an expert is someone called in at the last minute to share the blame. So the question then is raised, well, when do you call an expert? Obviously not at the last minute, and you're not sharing the blame, but you want someone to come in who has some expertise in meteorology that's going to help you out. To be able to tell you what the weather conditions are like. So I want to start this exercise by showing you some examples. This is a Google Earth map of southern Pennsylvania. And what's illuminated here with my finger is Cumberland County. This is Cumberland County, Pennsylvania. Philadelphia's up there. in the upper left. This is Gloucester County, and Pittsgrove Township is located in Salem County. And within Salem County is a state park called Parvin State Park, and you can actually see the lake located right here. This is some radar data. Actually, it's velocity data from the Fort Dix radar, located not too far away in south central Pennsylvania. This is why you bring in a meteorologist. This was a case where in June 29th of 2012, there was a cluster of thunderstorms kind of percolating in Indiana, and they organized and intensified rapidly. It became a line of storms, which we call a boa. And this line of storms tracked from Indiana to the mid-Atlantic coastline over the next 12 to 14 hours. There was a history of wind damage from Indiana all the way into Virginia and New Jersey, including a wind gust at the airport in Atlantic City of around 70, 75 miles per hour. Well, that line of storms became known as the historic derecho, D-E-R-E-C-H-O. It's a meteorological term. It actually comes from the Spanish, which means straight ahead. Well, in this case, that was a straight ahead line of wind damage that lasted more than 400 kilometers. Unfortunately, that line of storms moved over Parvin State Park, where there were people camping. And that line moved through the park shortly before 1 a.m. And there were a number of trees came down. And there were people out camping. And one of those trees, unfortunately, came down on a tent, and 2 young boys lost their lives. If you look at the radar data, I'm sure even in the back you can see that light area of green. Well, that was a wind gust. That was a wind speed at the elevation of the radar beam at greater than 70 knots. Okay, that's better than 80 miles per hour. Unfortunately, that's where the campsite was located. So I was brought in to take a look at the history of the storm and whether, in fact, there could have been winds of that magnitude that moved through the campsite that knocked down those trees. In the course of my investigation, I looked at what the Weather Service was doing. When did they issue warnings? When would the state police and also the park police have known that this storm was coming? And after writing my report and submitting it to the defense attorney in the Attorney General's office in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, they didn't file my report because it was not in their best interest to do so. I uncovered some things that said, yeah, there was information here ahead of time that should have been transmitted to the park police. And there are some liability issues here. That's why you bring in an expert. And that expert should have some experience both consulting or testifying, should have some demonstrated qualifications, and should have some experience in both trial and deposition. Now, you look at, in the first slide that I showed you, I had some credentials after my name. It said Ph.D., which stands for piled high and deep, by the way. And CCN, which is truly a certification. It stands for Certified Consulting Meteorologist. We were talking earlier about social media and the ease of accessing just about every bit of information you could ever imagine to anybody who wants it, including somebody who wants to play meteorologist. So there's a friend of mine who runs the National Weather Service office in Louisville, Kentucky. And during the winter time, they actually have to put someone on social media who responds to these forecasts of enormous amounts of snowfall. Because his office gets a phone call from the governor of Kentucky who says, I just read on social media that we're going to get 25 inches of snow 24 hours from now. Is that right? And so my friend who runs the office is saying, are you kidding me? Did that forecast come from the Weather Service? No, it didn't. But that's why you want to have someone who's got that expertise. Slips and falls. For some reason, this has become the most popular item in my textbook, it seems like. I get so many slips and fall cases. This was one that occurred in Trenton, New Jersey. The plaintiff in this case lived in the tenement, or in this building to the right in this picture. I was contacted by the attorney who said, we've got a slip and fall case that may have fraud associated with it. There are some pictures floating around provided by the plaintiff who claims that there was an enormous amount of ice and snow outside his residence that had been cleared by the landlord, the property owner. Would you take a look at this? Because we have already sent out our adjuster who looked at the weather data, and I chuckled when I heard that. He's already looked at the weather data and discovered that there's only 1.5 inches of snowfall. And the pictures that the plaintiffs are showing show a lot more than that. Would you investigate for us? Absolutely. Well, about 30 minutes into this investigation, I called the attorney. And I said, well, I think your adjuster misread the data. He read the amount of liquid equivalent, which is the number that you can get after melting ice and snow and combining that to any liquid precipitation. That's the liquid equivalent. So there was 8 inches of snow that when melted down was 1.5 inches of liquid. And the next thing I heard from the attorney was, don't write a report. I don't want to hear from you again. These are actual questions, and I'm going to separate the meteorologist in me from the forensic side. These are actual questions that were posed to me over the last few years. I'm getting married on this date next year. What kind of weather can I expect? And this has happened more than once, believe me. We are planning a cruise through the Caribbean during the second week of September. Should I buy traveler's insurance? My answer to the first question was, I could do no better than the average high and low temperature on that date 1 year away. That's all I can do for you. In this case, I said, are you aware that the peak in the hurricane season in the Caribbean is the second week of September? Oh. Do you recommend I buy the insurance? That's not my business. My business is to tell you what the weather could do. Okay, I'm going to buy the insurance. We are planning a graduation party in 2 days. Should I spend the money and rent the tent? Actual question that was posed to me. This is for a graduation party in Tucson, Arizona. Yeah. Actually, in this case, I recommended that they buy a tent because it was that time, or rent a tent, because that time of year, thunderstorms are prevalent. And any thunderstorm that occurs in the Southwest has the potential for producing small hail and very strong winds. Even if the rain doesn't reach the ground. Now, here's the forensic side. Was weather a factor in a fatal boating accident on the Potomac River? Was the live load on the roof? What was the live load on the roof of the structure? Was the home destroyed by wind or water? This question tied up 30,000 claims in Mississippi and Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina because I couldn't decide which came first. And the way the policy was written confused the issue. Allstate took it on the chin. I hope there's no representatives from Allstate here, but they took it on the chin after Katrina because these cases were tied up for so long. Were the weather conditions supportive of ice formation? I wish I had $1 for every time that question was been asked. And the last one, which I'm particularly interested in, is how rare was the event? How rare was it to receive 1.25 inches of rain in 15 minutes at this location? Does that happen every month, every year, every 5 years? We're going to explore a couple of these as we move along through the cases that I've got ahead of us. How about this picture? If you look very carefully, there's a satellite dish mounted right here. We've got windows in place and shingles on the roof. Maybe some of these shingles have been lost there, but then we're losing a bit of the house. So you're a forensic meteorologist. Wind or water? Well, this is very close to Staten Island and Staten Island Bay. This was Storm Surge that did this.
Look at the trees.
And look at the trees. Yeah. Suspected roof damage due to snow load. This is a riding arena that was built in East Aurora, New York. If you know anything about western New York near Buffalo, they get a tremendous amount of snow, lake effect snow. But look carefully at this. See where the snow is located between these windows, and it kind of piles up and falls to the ground. So I worked on this case with an engineer who looked at the footings associated with this riding arena when it was installed. And there is a drainage area that runs right through here. Well, there was some problems with the roof, but it wasn't because of the snow. It was improperly constructed and failed because of the way the footings were placed. This is one that came to me just in the last couple of months. This is a very expensive tennis center in northern New Jersey. Unfortunately, they didn't put the end back on the building yet. This was experienced some roof failure. And so I was asked, well, the storm that just occurred in March of this year produced some very heavy snow in northern New Jersey. There were some locations that experienced 20 inches of snow. And as I reminded the individuals involved in this case, it's not the depth of the snow that's important. It's the liquid water contained in that snow. So we have to make an estimate of the load from the amount of water that's contained within that snow. And I said, there's no way. Now, these structures should be built to withstand 20 to 30 pounds per square foot of a live load, in addition to the dead load, which is the weight of the roof itself. Well, then they said, well, this case has been going on for a while. We've recognized that there have been some roof issues, and there's trusses that have been put up here, some scaffolding to try to hold the roof up. In this very affluent community in New Jersey, they want their tennis center back. Would you go back and look at the record? And I said, well, yeah. How far back do you want me to go? And so I looked back at February of 2014. Yeah, there was a big snowstorm that occurred. In fact, a couple of them in February of 2014 that probably exceeded the load capacity. This is a fatal boating accident that occurred on the Potomac River, the tidal Potomac, where it empties into the Chesapeake Bay. So I was asked to reconstruct the weather at the time of this boating accident. The Maryland State Maryland State Sportsmen's Association conducts an annual fish competition right out here at Point Lookout State Park. So you go out, you fish, you come back in, and you weigh your catch. And then they have prizes and awards for those who get the biggest catch. Well, these guys left, 4 of them in a boat, left from Combs Creek Marina, and they sailed down to Point Lookout. And then they went fishing, they brought their catch back in, and then their plan was to sail back up the Potomac River, back to where they parked. They had heard that maybe the weather was changing, but they made a decision to go anyway, back up the Potomac River. They got to roughly this position, which is very close to a buoy. In fact, one of the last transmissions from the boat mentioned that they were near this buoy. And then they capsized, and 3 of the 4 lost their lives. So what I did was I reconstructed the position of a very strong cold front that swept through the Potomac River down towards the Chesapeake Bay. The temperature when they were out on the bay was about 70 degrees. Behind the cold front, it was 45 degrees. And the winds were greater than 40 knots, sustained at greater than 20 knots, which was producing 3 to 5 foot waves. And that's what capsized the boat. So the question was, who's at fault? And should they have been on the Potomac River at all? And actually, there were some questions as about whether the fishermen's tournament should have been held at all, because an outlook for a gale event was actually posted by the Weather Service the day before. They had advanced it. And they actually had pretty good notice of when this was going to come across. This is $1.5 million plane. And it's pending. I don't know where it is right now, but the data told me exactly when that line moved through. I get a lot of hail cases, a lot of hail fraud. Something like this is pretty obvious, isn't it? It's a 2-year-old with a ball-peen hammer just banging away on a piece of aged plastic. But aged plastic is great. It records the size of the hailstone that goes through it. By the way, this was up at the gable of the house, not what a 2-year-old could get to it. And by the way, if you're ever questioning whether there's been hail fraud, and you can see the dimples on the side of the home, if those dimples stop at a particular height, that's usually a giveaway. Or if the homeowner says, I've got hail damage all around my house. Well, how can that happen if the storm is moving from one direction to the other? Well, I've actually had it more than once where a home has been hit by 2 separate hailstorms with opposite directions. It is possible to have hail on more than 2 sides of a home. But this is a difficult one to get a handle on. You often want to see an engineer get out there and look at the roof. So having a drone avoids the complication of actually having to climb on the roof. I work with a company out in Oklahoma called Weather Decision Technologies, and they have developed an algorithm will actually look at the radar data in 3 dimension, which is something I'm doing intellectually, but they've actually got an algorithm that's doing that, and they'll plot a hail swath given a set of criteria. This is for a hailstorm that occurred between Wilkes-Barre, which is down here, and Scranton, Pennsylvania, not too far from here. So I was able to plot where the claims had been originated, as well as where some of the reports that had come in associated with hail, and address the potential for hail at the different properties that way. Lightning, lightning, lightning. It's amazing how many lightning storms do not strike a residence directly. The current is entering the home through the ground in most cases. Here's an example of a tree being struck by lightning, and you can see where the current went. So I'm often asked, what about this home? Could it have been hit by lightning because the homeowner or the commercial property owner is claiming all the electricals are gone? Everything's failed. Well, I can actually look at the lightning data, which I get from a vendor, and make an assessment as to whether that lightning could have traveled through the ground and entered the property. This is an article that was written following a wind event that occurred in Linden, New Jersey, back in 2014. And the article says, high winds are being claimed or blamed for a construction accident at the former General Motors site. Well, that is what the General Motors site looks like now. They built it. But while it was under construction, the workers were installing steel and girders at this end of the building. And my investigation showed that there was a period of very strong winds from the northwest at the time that they were constructing this building. Well, those winds themselves should not have been strong enough to cause the construction failure. But the winds were there for a relatively long period of time. And if the construction is not designed properly, it can develop a bit of a harmonic when it experiences these kinds of winds. So my opinion was these winds probably developed a wall nature to the structure, and that's what led to the failure. This is a multi-vehicle, multi-tractor trailer accident on, I think this was, it's Interstate 80, not too far from here. Visibility tends to be an issue in automobile accidents. I mentioned earlier we lose situational awareness. Why do we drive into fog at 70 miles an hour when we can't see the hand in front of our face? Well, these 3 tractor trailers did just that. They were driving at 65 miles per hour or better and encountered, my estimate, a visibility that was less than 1/25th of a mile. We report at the Weather Service an 1/8 of a mile, a 1/4 of a mile, or a 1/16th of a mile. And I found that this was more like a 25th of a mile. In fact, the state police, when they responded to this accident, couldn't find it. The fog was that bad. So this is 3 tractor trailers. Unfortunately, there was a fatality involved. And when I looked at the terrain, which is where my geology actually helps me out, I looked at the terrain and the potential for fog formation. Right there on the highway is where you would expect it. Hurricane Irene, back in 2011, was not a big deal here in Pennsylvania. The worst of it went over New York City and then up into New England. But it hit Vermont exceptionally hard. All of the infrastructure in many locations in Vermont is along the roadways because of the terrain. So if the roadways are lost due to erosion from flooding, then you're going to lose power, you're going to lose electrical, you're going to lose phone. And if you look at this picture of one of the roadways in Vermont, you can see that it is gone and all of the conduits and the lines are out here exposed. So I was hired by Vermont Telephone to look at 85 claims in the state of Vermont that were a result of Hurricane Irene. And what they asked me was, can you tell us whether the flooding that resulted in the erosion of the road and then ultimately the loss of the infrastructure was a consequence of a 100-year flood or a 500-year flood? Well, that's the way the policy was written. So this is a complicated diagram, but it was one I put in my report that said, at this particular location, here's the loss site, that it was outside the 100-year flood, but within the 500-year flood. So of the 85 claims that were made to Vermont Telephone, I think about 60% of them were going to be covered, but that still means 40% were not. So this was a six-figure loss for the telephone company. This is a slip and fall that led, unfortunately, to a fatality at a warehouse in Pennsylvania a couple of years ago. And I was called in to look at the weather conditions, obviously. Well, from that picture, it's pretty obvious, right? There was snow on the ground. And you can actually see the outline of a tractor trailer and where the tires were. So obviously the trailer was sitting there when the snow fell. This tractor trailer obviously backed in after the snow fell because the tires were on top of the snow. And I looked at this and I stared at this for quite some time. It was the driver of this truck who got out of his truck, ended up slipping and falling on the other side, hit his head on the ground. Another one of those unfortunate situations. But I looked at this. I don't know if you can see this in the back, but there was something that really bugged me until I looked at this more carefully. See, there's an overhang here? And there's a loading area, a dock area here. But look at this overhang. Bring it down and look at this. So what was happening was the snow would fall on that overhang, and then you would get the daytime sunlight on the metal surface. Remember, temperatures don't have to be, the air temperature does not have to be 32 degrees or above to lead to melting. All you need is direct sunlight and substrate to warm it. What was happening was the snow was melting and falling off and then accumulating a ridge of ice here. Homeowner to the northwest of this refinery fire claimed soot damage to her home as a result of this explosion which occurred at this Sunoco refinery. So I investigated. This is a major event, but it occurred southeast of where she lived. I looked at the wind directions, and it turns out the evening before this fire erupted, there was a cold front. And the cold front pushed through to the south. All the winds aloft were coming out of the northwest. There was no way soot from this fire could have reached her property. And to even look at that further, I used what's known as a back trajectory model, which says if the particle ends up in a specific location, where did it start? And it confirmed my conclusion that there was no way that soot from this fire could have gone against the winds and up to her property. And I'm going to finish here talking about Sandy. We've heard about Sandy was almost a perfect storm. It resulted in record flooding and record storm surge around Staten Island and New York City. Well, this is a graph which shows time along the bottom, and it shows water level and elevation in feet above a datum. And the USGS, the Geological Survey, installed a number of sensors prior to Sandy and created an astounding data set that we can use. So what you're seeing here with time is the high tide. And then there's a low tide, which the sensor is not getting. It's below the height of the sensor. And then you see the next high tide. And then the next high tide. And within each tidal cycle are the waves on top, superimposed on top of the tide. Well, you may know this already, but Hurricane Sandy, when it made landfall, coincided with an astronomical high tide, and it coincided with a full moon. So the lowest pressure associated with the closest approach of Sandy was between the high tide and the full moon. And you can see the peak water elevation, which was better than 14 feet above the datum. Well, this prompted, at the time, the mayor of New York to say, no, it was Governor Cuomo, and he said that we need to install mesonets across the entire state of New York to improve our forecasting, because this is going to happen every time we have the tropical system approach New York. Well, historically, a tropical system could approach Manhattan once every 22 years. So that's not going to be an issue every year. And to have a tropical system which moved parallel to the mid-Atlantic coast, make a left-hand turn directly into the coast at this time of high tide and full moon, the expectation that would occur once every 700 years. That's based on some study done at the university, at Rutgers University. But if they were to come together, this is the kind of outcome that you could result in, right? And you get some of these amazing debris lines that were visible across the area. And the last picture of a home, you can see it there with the red arrow. I guess if you have lots and lots of money, you can build a home on a spit of land sticking out into Long Island Sound. And if we zoom in on that home, these are the wind directions. This is southeast, south-southeast, southeast, and northeast. And there's a $10 million home on this spit of land with a 15-foot seawall, which was designed to protect them. And then the entire portion of the home facing to the east, which is where they want to see, right? You can look out over the sound, was all glass. Well, the winds associated with Sandy took care of the glass. And the storm surge with the waves on top went over the seawall and brought in salt water into the home and ruined the entire home. So the claim was they've got flood into their home and they had flood insurance. Not for salt water. They had flood insurance for flooding from fresh water, but not salt water. That was a $10 million home. So I'd like to finish here with 4 thoughts. This is my position. The forensic meteorologist renders an opinion based entirely on the facts. The facts are presented without passion or prejudice. I don't take a side. I'm non-political when it comes to data. And I confine my opinion to my area of expertise. I was deposed a number of years ago in Baltimore, and the plaintiff's attorney who represented a commercial building owner asked me about the structural integrity of the roof, which failed due to record snowfall in Baltimore. I'm sorry, sir, I can't go there. I'm a meteorologist. I'm not a structural engineer. I appreciate your time this morning, and I'll take any questions you might have. Thanks. How are we doing on time? No questions. So as a professor of mine in graduate school would say, great, that means you understand all the material, and we're going to start the test now.
Thank you.
My pleasure.